She was 27 the night the light went out on her life, an ordinary age, ordinary plans, an ordinary October evening that folded itself quiet and thin over a small Wisconsin town. The road to her apartment swallowed the headlights, a screen door clicked and then did not click again. A steaming mug cooled on a kitchen counter, its faint ring left on Formica like a clock stopped at a single unbearable minute. Neighbors remember the hush, that strange soft silence that comes when something in the neighborhood has been moved and not replaced. A car that should have been there was gone, a voice that should have called never called, and the ordinary rhythms of a life broke like glass across a linoleum floor. How does a life vanish in the middle of ordinary life, and why did it take years to uncover the truth? The question lands like a stone thrown into still water. The ripples spread wider than the town itself. People who pass one another at the hardware store and smile across aisles would later find their memories sharpened into something accusatory. The way he wore his coat, the way she paused at a window, the way a promise to call you later became a hollow echo. This was not a sudden gust of fate. It had the slow pressure of something that had been building, of a look lingered too long, of keys jingling when they shouldn't. In the dark that night, small details became evidence by their absence. A favorite sweater left draped on a chair like someone who would return for it. A phone that dimmed and never brightened with replies. A voicemail unheard until the family found it and listened on repeat. The tone of worry folding into disbelief. The town's lights blinked on and off like a seesaw of reassurance. At first, people told themselves she had simply stepped out of sight, given the world a needed pause. Then, as hours bent into days, that paternal optimism frayed into something harder: suspicion, fear, the urgent animal need to know. There is a terror in ordinary places when the ordinary is broken. The cornfields that had been backdrop to Sunday drives and late-night conversations took on a new privacy. The long gravel roads that led to porches now seemed to conceal more than they revealed. Faces at the local diner hardened in the retelling of small, almost trivial observations that, when stacked together, began to look like pieces of a map. A shadow of a man who would not let go, someone whose presence had been tolerated, whose behavior had been minimized, moved through the margins of those early hours, an ordinary figure whose ordinariness became the worst kind of camouflage. This is the instant a town realized it had a missing life on its hands, and the moment when the search for answers began. Cassandra Ayon was 27. Standing at that fragile edge between youth and the long stretch of adulthood, a place where dreams and responsibilities are still balancing on the same scale. In Unity, Wisconsin, Ayon's life unfolded in rhythms both ordinary and luminous. She carried with her the quiet strength of someone who had already weathered storms but still held fast to small, shining hopes. She dreamed of stability, of carving out a space in the world that was hers alone. Some days that meant finishing studies she had set aside. Other days it was the thought of a family in the future, laughter filling a home of her own. Those who knew her best describe her warmth as a kind of presence you felt before she even spoke, her laughter softening whatever heaviness lingered in the air. Her mornings were stitched together with modest rituals. A mug of coffee, sometimes gone cold on the counter as she hurried out into the sharp bite of autumn air. The streets in Unity were never crowded, but she moved through them with familiarity, as though every brick, every storefront, every patch of cracked sidewalk recognized her footsteps. The local cafe knew her order by heart, and the grocery aisles carried memories of routine stops, picking up tortillas, a favorite brand of tea, ingredients for simple meals she cooked for family visits. There was a tenderness in her connections at home. Weekly phone calls with her mother that stretched far longer than planned, spilling over with the chatter of daily life, and dinners with siblings where teasing banter gave way to moments of deep, unspoken support.
Family was her anchor, even as she sought independence, and she wore that bond like a second skin. But shadows had begun to gather around her bright world. At first, there had been charm. A man who knew how to smile at the right time, who leaned close with words that sounded like promises. Jesus Contreras Perez, her ex-boyfriend, had once seemed an ordinary chapter in her story. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, his presence grew heavier, his need for control shaping itself into something darker. Friends recalled the shift in her tone when she spoke about him. The nervous laugh, the glance over her shoulder, the way her voice thinned when she admitted she felt watched. What does it mean when love becomes a cage? How do you name it when the hand that once held yours begins to tighten, not in affection, but in possession? For Ayon, the shift was terrifyingly real. The relationship that had once carried hope unraveled into fear, and the man who had once stood beside her now lingered in the corners of her life like a shadow that refused to let her go. Yet she kept moving through her days with a resilience that masked the fear from those who didn't look too closely. In the cafe, she still smiled at the barista. On the phone, she still told her mother she was fine. Walking through the park, she still looked like any other young woman breathing in the crisp Wisconsin air. But beneath that appearance, a storm was pressing closer, silent and relentless. This was Ayon's world, an ordinary life layered with quiet strength, tender connections, and the invisible weight of fear pressing down with every step. And it is from this world, so achingly human, that her disappearance would tear a hole too deep for her family, her friends, and her town to ever fill. And it is here, in the fragile threads of her daily existence, that the stage is set for the night everything changed.
Under the wide skies of central Wisconsin, the town of Unity rests quietly between stretches of farmland and two-lane highways that seem to run forever. It is the kind of place where the pace of life slows just enough for people to notice the small things. The first frost glistening on the edges of hay bales, the rust-colored leaves curling at the edges of maple branches, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys as October settles in. In 2020, while the wider world reeled from uncertainty, Unity carried on with its steady rhythms. Families still gathered at kitchen tables, farmers rose before dawn to tend to their fields, and the church bells rang faithfully on Sunday mornings, reminding people that tradition held strong even when the world outside did not. The town itself is modest, a scattering of homes, a few small businesses, the local school that doubles as a hub for Friday night games. In the early evenings, the streets grow eerily quiet, and once the sun sinks below the horizon, darkness presses down like a blanket. There are no city lights here, only the faint glow of porch bulbs and the occasional passing headlights sweeping across rows of corn stalks. At night, silence reigns so completely that even the sound of wind brushing through the fields can feel startling. On the lonelier back roads, you might drive for miles without seeing another car, just the endless silhouettes of barns and silos against the sky. In Unity, people know each other by name. At the local cafe, the waitress remembers how you take your coffee. At the grocery store, neighbors pause in the aisles to swap news, their words carrying that mix of genuine care and small-town gossip that has always thrived in places like this. It is a place where doors are left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but from an enduring belief that real danger belongs somewhere else, in the distant cities, on the evening news, not here. Yet beneath the simplicity lies a tension that outsiders rarely notice. The very isolation that makes the town feel safe can also leave it exposed. With miles of open land and few watchful eyes, anything can happen in the shadows between one farmhouse and the next. On certain nights, when the roads are empty and the air is sharp, you can feel how fragile safety truly is.
What would you have noticed in those quiet streets? Would you have sensed the darkness waiting just beyond the glow of a kitchen light? As autumn deepened in 2020, the people of Unity went about their lives, unaware that the familiar comfort of their routines was about to be shaken, and that their small town would soon carry a story they could never forget. On the evening of October 3, 2020, the quiet rhythm of Unity, Wisconsin began to fracture. For those who knew her best, Ayon's absence was not something that could be brushed aside. She was steady, almost predictable in her reliability, the kind of person who showed up when she said she would, who answered messages quickly, who kept her world in order even in the midst of life's struggles. That night, however, she never appeared for a simple gathering with friends, a meeting she had promised to attend. At first, it seemed like a small slip, the kind of delay explained by traffic or fatigue. But as minutes turned into hours, silence began to carry a weight that felt unbearable. Her phone, once a tether of connection, went dark. Calls rang unanswered. Messages were never read. It was as though she had vanished into the folds of the October night. Inside her apartment, the traces of her life sat undisturbed. A jacket draped carelessly over the back of a chair, a purse resting by the door, a half-finished cup of tea cooling on the table. These ordinary objects, once invisible in their simplicity, became markers of the exact moment her life was interrupted. They stood frozen in time, as though holding their breath, waiting for her to return. But she never did. Neighbors would later recall something unsettling, a detail that at first seemed trivial but grew more haunting with each retelling. A car had been seen idling near her apartment that night, its headlights washing pale against the siding, its engine humming in the stillness of the small town. No one thought much of it then. In a place where life is slow and suspicion rare, who would? But in hindsight, that image, the car waiting, lingering, became an omen of what was already unfolding. The longer the silence stretched, the sharper the unease became. Her friends scrolled through old messages, replaying her words, searching for hidden hints they might have missed. Her family clung to the hope that she had simply taken space for herself, though their hearts told them otherwise. Because when someone like Ayon goes missing, it is not an accident. Her absence was not a choice. It was a rupture. And as the hours slipped into the early morning, what began as confusion hardened into fear. The last thread of her presence had been cut, leaving only questions echoing through the emptiness she left behind. It was in that silence, raw and unbroken, that the true gravity of her disappearance began to take hold.
The first hours after Ayon's disappearance were filled with the kind of restless confusion that blurs the line between hope and dread. When the call reached the police, their response was careful, measured, almost clinical. Was this a young woman who had chosen to step away from her life for a time, or was something far more sinister unfolding in their quiet town? That hesitation, those critical early hours lost in weighing possibility against probability, became the ache that her family would carry forever. For those who loved her, waiting was impossible. Her siblings moved quickly, covering telephone poles and cafe windows with flyers bearing her photograph, the ink smudging beneath their fingertips as the autumn air dampened the paper. Her mother's voice cracked through countless calls to hospitals and urgent care clinics, clinging desperately to the faintest hope that her daughter might be found injured but alive. Friends scoured the places where Ayon's footsteps had once been so familiar. The corner store where she picked up groceries, the park bench where she sometimes read, the cafe where she liked her coffee strong and simple. Every search ended with the same hollow result: nothing. Unity itself seemed to stir uneasily. A town where most nights were marked only by the buzz of crickets and the passing of tractors suddenly found itself whispering at kitchen tables and murmuring across pews at Sunday service. Rumors bloomed like weeds. One neighbor, sharp-eyed and perhaps sharper-tongued, insisted she had seen Jesus Contreras Perez, Ayon's ex, lurking in the shadows near her apartment days before she vanished. A local reporter picked up the story, weaving fragments into headlines that carried Ayon's name beyond Unity's borders. The whispers that had lived in private conversations about his temper, his control, her growing fear, began to take shape in public. Coworkers replayed old conversations in their minds, remembering the tremor in her voice when she admitted she didn't feel safe. One recalled her words with a clarity that made the skin prickle on the back of her neck. Why hadn't more been done then? Why had her fears been dismissed as the struggles of a complicated relationship? The search grew beyond her immediate circle. Strangers joined in, combing through ditches and walking along fields where cornstalks rattled in the wind like brittle bones. The sheriff's office mapped routes, volunteers trudged through mud and tall grass, and the air filled with the mingled sounds of determination and despair. But as the days passed, the absence became heavier. In grocery aisles, conversations hushed when her name was mentioned. Mothers tightened their grip on their daughters' hands. Women began locking their doors earlier, some carrying pepper spray and purses that had never held anything more dangerous than a set of keys. The illusion of safety and unity cracked, revealing a truth no one wanted to face. Even in small towns where life feels untouched by violence, danger can take root quietly, right in the open. By the end of that first week, it was no longer just Ayon's family searching. It was the entire town, pulled into her disappearance like moths circling a dark flame. And as their footsteps grew heavier and their questions sharper, the shadow of suspicion grew clearer with every passing day. It was in that restless, anxious air that the investigation began to change direction.
The investigation into Ayon's disappearance began like so many others, with wide, frantic nets cast into every corner of possibility. Detectives followed leads that stretched from her workplace to distant highways, clinging to the hope that she might have simply chosen to step away, even if only for a while. Co-workers were questioned, their daily routines dissected, their memories picked apart for anything unusual. A passing truck driver claimed to have seen a young woman walking along the roadside, sparking a flurry of activity that ended in another dead end. Strangers were scrutinized, tips trickled in, but every supposed clue dissolved into air as investigators pressed forward. And yet with every road exhausted, every rumor burned away, one name always reemerged, steady and immovable like a shadow that refused to fade: Jesus Contreras Perez. From the very beginning, those closest to Ayon had warned authorities about him. They spoke of his presence around her life like a storm cloud that would not move on. They told of his controlling nature, the nights she confided in whispers that she felt watched, the unwanted messages that arrived long after their relationship had ended. But official reports often framed it as little more than relationship troubles, the kind of drama that towns had seen before. What harm could truly come from a man she had once loved? That quiet dismissal, those blind spots in the system, became the cracks where tragedy took root. Perez's behavior grew darker in hindsight. Neighbors would later remember his car creeping slowly down her street, headlights off, his silhouette barely visible behind the glass. He sent her messages at odd hours, their tone swinging wildly from pleading to angry, from apologies to threats, hidden between the lines. There were times he seemed to linger in the very places she was known to frequent, waiting at the edge of her world. He smiled when others looked, polite, even charming to those who barely knew him. But behind that smile lay something else entirely, something that Ayon herself had begun to fear. For her family, the frustration was unbearable. They watched investigators circle around other suspects, chase fleeting theories, even question whether she had left of her own accord. Each wasted day felt like a wound reopening, proof that the system designed to protect her was instead caught in hesitation. They knew where the answers lay, but convincing others of the danger he posed seemed like shouting into the wind. And so the case dragged.
tangled in its own missteps, haunted by what might have been done sooner. If the reports of stalking had been met with urgency rather than caution, would the outcome have been different? If her quiet fears had been taken seriously, could her story have ended another way? What would you have thought if you saw him smile across the street, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on something you couldn't see? As weeks bled into months, the investigation grew colder on its surface, yet beneath it all, Perez's name remained a constant echo, the one thread tying every piece together. And it was only a matter of time before that thread pulled the entire story into the open.
The years that followed Ayon's disappearance stretched long and merciless, each one carving deeper grooves into the hearts of those who loved her. Time did not move gently in unity. It dragged, heavy and relentless, pressing the weight of unanswered questions into every corner of the town. Each October brought with it a painful ritual, candles lit in the cool evening air, faces illuminated by flickering flames as neighbors gathered for vigils. Hands clutched photographs that were slowly curling at the edges, the colors fading with each passing season. Rain streaked ink across posters that once seemed urgent, now dulled by weather and neglect, their images almost ghost-like against the boards where they hung. Her parents carried the years on their faces. Grief had etched itself into their very skin, deepening the lines around their eyes, pulling their shoulders forward under an invisible burden. Their voices grew quieter, yet more desperate every time they spoke her name in public. To strangers, they were simply aging. To those who knew, the truth was far harsher. They were being hollowed out by absence, piece by piece, year after year. Her bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to a life paused mid-step. A jacket still hung on the back of her chair, her favorite book resting open on the nightstand, as if she might return at any moment to slip beneath the covers and pick up where she left off. But the dust that gathered on those objects told the real story. Time was moving forward, even if the family could not. Meanwhile, unity itself seemed divided by the silence. Some clung to hope with aching devotion, convinced that somewhere, somehow, she might still be alive. Others muttered theories of escape, suggesting that perhaps she had run away, vanished into another life far from the reach of her troubles. Rumors churned in grocery store aisles and over morning coffee. A sighting at a gas station miles away, a woman on a bus who looked just like her, a whisper of someone hiding in plain sight. Each lead flared like a match in the dark, only to burn out quickly, leaving nothing but smoke and disappointment behind. The town's rhythm shifted as the years accumulated. In the beginning, nearly everyone searched, nearly everyone spoke her name. But with time, silence crept in. Children grew older, new families moved in, and life's distractions dulled the urgency of her story. For some, the case became an echo of the past, too painful or too exhausting to carry forward. But for others, forgetting was impossible. Ayon's absence was a constant presence, in the locked doors at dusk, in the nervous glance when headlights slowed too long on a quiet street, in the unease that settled over even the most ordinary nights. Unity was a place that once believed itself safe, untouched by the kind of cruelty reserved for headlines in distant cities. But after Ayon, the air never felt quite the same. The silence that hung over the town was not peaceful. It was raw, a wound left open, one that no amount of time seemed able to close. And then, after years of waiting, a single moment of truth began to stir, a flicker of light in the long shadow of her absence.
It was May of 2021 when the first crack in the long wall of silence finally appeared. After years of speculation, rumors, and empty leads, the case jolted forward with a charge that at first seemed narrow in scope, but hinted at a much darker truth waiting just beneath the surface. Perez, once a figure spoken about in hushed tones and sidelong glances, was officially accused of stalking that had caused bodily harm. It was a charge that carried weight, but in the context of Ayon's absence, it was more than a legal headline. It was a spark, the beginning of something that had eluded investigators and the community for far too long. The charge painted a disturbing portrait. Stalking is not just following from a distance, it is intrusion into the rhythm of another person's life, the slow erosion of safety, the constant reminder that someone's shadow lingers even in places meant to feel private. For those who had watched Ayon's story unfold, the accusation confirmed what many had feared all along. She had not vanished into thin air. She had been watched, pursued, and targeted. What once were whispers about Perez now solidified into a hard fact on paper. The justice system was beginning to name him aloud. But only a month later, the ground shifted again, and this time it was not a crack, but an earthquake. In June, prosecutors escalated the charges in a way that sent shock through the town and beyond. Perez was no longer facing accusations of surveillance and intimidation. He was now standing accused of homicide, of deliberately taking a life and of concealing the body to erase every trace of what he had done. It was the kind of announcement that stopped conversations mid-sentence, that drew people back to the painful question they had carried for years. If Ayon was gone, where was she now? The horror was sharpened by a chilling detail that made the trial unlike almost any other. This was a no-body case. No remains had been discovered, no final resting place uncovered to give her family even the bitter peace of certainty. The charges relied on evidence, on patterns of behavior, on fragments pieced together into a picture so clear that prosecutors were ready to stand in court and declare that a murder had been committed, even though the victim herself was still missing. No-body homicide trials are rare. They demand precision, courage, and absolute confidence in the evidence. For they ask a jury to believe in the reality of a crime without the most visceral proof of all. For the community of Unity, it was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Could justice truly be served without her body? Could the truth be recognized even when the most painful piece was still absent? In every corner of town, the news was received with disbelief, outrage, and grim recognition. For Ayon's parents, the words homicide and hiding a corpse struck like blows to the chest, confirming what they had feared in the darkest corners of their hearts but had never wanted to hear aloud. For neighbors and classmates, the escalation was proof that the case they had carried in their bones for years was not a story fading into silence. It was alive, it was urgent, and justice was finally closing in. Even before her body was found, the walls of secrecy were collapsing. Step by step, the truth was clawing its way into the light. And in that summer of 2021, the question was no longer whether Perez had something to hide, but how much darker the hidden truth might be. The summer air was heavy the day the news broke, carrying with it a silence that felt thicker than words. Perez, the man who had once walked hand in hand with Ayon down the familiar streets of Unity, was no longer a question mark in the case. He was no longer just a name whispered in suspicion, or a figure glimpsed from a passing car. He was revealed, not as the quiet boyfriend many had assumed he was, but as the man accused of ending her life. The shock did not come with fireworks of frenzy. It came with the stillness of realization,
the kind that grips a town and makes every corner feel suddenly unsafe. When he entered the courtroom, the world saw him differently. His posture was rigid, his gaze steady in a way that made the air feel colder. There was no flicker of remorse, no trembling hand, no downcast eyes. Instead, there was a calm detachment, the kind of demeanor that chills those watching because it leaves no trace of the humanity people expect in moments of reckoning. To some, it felt as though he wasn't present at all, as though the weight of the charges, homicide, concealment, betrayal, rolled off him like rain on glass. But to others, that silence and stillness spoke louder than any outburst could have. Beneath the surface of that unflinching exterior lay a history that investigators and prosecutors began to trace with surgical precision. Patterns of control stretched back to the days when he and Ayon were still together. It was in the way he monitored her movements, the way a simple disagreement could spiral into anger, the way affection blurred so easily into possession. Obsession had a quiet rhythm to it. A car idling too long on a street corner, a phone lighting up with messages that grew darker as they multiplied, a shadow that seemed to appear even in places meant to feel private. Some looked deeper, trying to understand whether the roots of his violence reached back into his childhood, into years where frustration had hardened into fury, where learning to dominate had replaced learning to let go. Others saw in him a man who could not accept rejection, who could not imagine life without the one person he had claimed as his own. Was it jealousy that drove him? Was it the gnawing fear of being left behind? Or was it simply the hunger for control, taken to its most brutal end? For the community of Unity, the revelation carried an unbearable weight. This was not a stranger who had slipped into their lives from some distant place. This was someone they knew, someone they had nodded to in grocery store aisles, someone who had once been welcomed at family dinners, at local gatherings, at the small rituals of daily life. He was not the shadow lurking on the edges of town. He had been standing in the light, among them, his mask held firmly in place. It is one thing to fear the unknown. It is another to learn that the danger has always been close, familiar, hidden in plain sight. The betrayal was not just of Ayon, but of an entire community who now had to reckon with the fact that the monster they feared wasn't somewhere far away. He had been there all along, blending into the rhythms of ordinary life, wearing a smile that disguised a darkness no one wanted to believe. And as Perez stood before the court, stripped of his cover and named for what he was, Unity faced the kind of truth that scars a place forever. A truth that left them wondering what signs they had missed and how long he had been hiding in plain sight. But the trial was only beginning, and with it, the slow march toward a final reckoning.
The courthouse in Unity stood like a stone sentinel, its steps worn smooth by decades of small-town disputes, petty crimes, and civil hearings. But in the summer of 2022, it became the stage for something far heavier, a trial that drew the weight of grief, fear, and anticipation into a single room. The air inside carried that unmistakable mixture of varnished wood, recycled air, and the faint sharpness of old paper. Every bench was filled not only by those who knew Ayon, but by neighbors, co-workers, and strangers who felt compelled to witness the reckoning. The silence that settled before testimony was called was not the silence of calm, it was the silence of people holding their breath. On one side of the room sat her family, their hands clasped so tightly that knuckles blanched, shoulders hunched forward as if bracing against invisible waves. Ayon's mother clutched a worn handkerchief, the fabric damp with tears shed in quiet moments, her face a map of sleepless nights. Her father sat rigid, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the man accused of stealing the daughter he could no longer protect.
Around them, friends leaned into one another for strength, blinking back tears that seemed to rise unbidden with every pause in the proceedings. Across the aisle, Perez appeared unyielding. Dressed in the neutral tones of court-issued clothing, he gave away nothing. Some said his stillness was unnerving, a performance of control. Others thought it was arrogance, a refusal to acknowledge the destruction that surrounded him. But his presence alone filled the room with an oppressive weight, as though the darkness of what he had done lingered in the very air. The jurors sat with expressions carved from stone, their eyes scanning witness after witness, their pens scratching quietly as testimony spilled into the room. A coworker recounted the way Ayon's voice had grown tight when his name came up, how she confessed that he wouldn't stop calling, wouldn't stop watching. A friend described the late-night drives past her home, the unwanted gifts left like warnings on her doorstep. Each detail stacked upon the last, building a tower of obsession and menace that painted the portrait of a man who could not, would not let go. But what made it unbearable was the absence at the center of it all. No body had been recovered. No grave had been dug. Every word spoken in court was heavy with that void, the knowledge that the victim's presence was felt only in memory, in photographs, in the voices of those who loved her. The prosecution leaned into that emptiness, reminding the jury that absence itself could be evidence, that silence can scream louder than sound. Day after day the testimonies cut deeper. A neighbor recalled the figure of a man pacing near her house in the early hours. An investigator described the trail of digital footprints, messages that shifted from pleading to threatening, each one more chilling than the last. The defense tried to sow doubt, pointing to the lack of physical remains, suggesting that possibilities still lingered in the shadows. But with every witness, with every photograph, with every recorded message, that doubt shrank, eclipsed by the chilling pattern of control and escalation that Perez had carved into her life. The gallery hung on each word, the scrape of a chair or the cough of a spectator punctuating the tension. Some days the family walked out in tears, unable to bear another layer of cruelty exposed before them. Other days they remained seated, faces hardened by determination, as if their stillness was its own testimony, a declaration that they would not look away. And then, after weeks of testimony, after hours of deliberation behind closed doors, the verdict came. June 2022. Guilty on all charges, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words echoed across the courtroom, sinking into every heart differently. For some it was relief, the long-awaited confirmation that justice had not been denied. For others it was torment, because victory in court could not fill the hole left behind. Justice had come without a body, without the closure of a grave to visit, without the ritual of a final goodbye. It was a rare verdict, both triumphant and cruel in its finality. As the gavel fell and the court adjourned, the town of Unity exhaled together for the first time in years. Yet the air was not cleared. It carried with it the weight of what had been lost forever, and the knowledge that even justice cannot silence grief. The story did not end at the courthouse steps. It lingered in the lives left behind. By 2024, Unity had grown used to living with questions that never found answers. Ayon's absence had stretched into years, her name spoken at vigils, her face staring back from fading photographs taped to church bulletin boards and coffee shop walls. Yet, beneath the rhythms of ordinary life, her story remained like an unhealed fracture in the community's bones. And then, in late autumn, the fracture split open once more. In Brighton, Wisconsin, a discovery was made in a quiet stretch of land where the wind moved low through the grass and the earth carried the scent of damp soil. Partial remains, weathered by time, hidden in the folds of nature's silence. The news traveled quickly, carried first on hushed police radios, then spilling into headlines, before finally reaching the family who had waited for a call they both dreaded and longed for. December 2024 confirmed what the heart had known but refused to fully accept. Ayon had been found. For her family, the confirmation was a cruel mercy. They finally had a place, a body to name, an ending to the story that had tormented their nights. But the relief of knowing was laced with fresh agony. Each detail cut deep. Where she was left, what she endured, how long she had been there. No verdict, no sentence, no gavel striking wood could undo the years she was denied or the suffering written into her last moments. A chair at their table remained empty, but now it carried a finality that no imagination could soften. The town, too, felt the weight of that discovery. Vigils that once shimmered with hope shifted into memorials etched with sorrow. Candles no longer flickered for her safe return. They burned for remembrance, for mourning, for warning. Silence was replaced by speeches, by calls to recognize the dangers that often hide in plain sight. From church halls to high school gyms, the tragedy became a catalyst, sparking programs about domestic violence, safety workshops, and conversations that once felt too uncomfortable to voice. Teachers wove awareness into classrooms. Pastors reminded congregations that faith without vigilance can cost lives. Employers began to ask the questions they once overlooked. Unity's identity changed. It was no longer just a small town where neighbors waved from porches and everyone knew your name. It was also a place that carried the shadow of a story, reminding all of us that danger doesn't always come from the stranger in the alley. Sometimes it comes from the smile across the street, from the person who refuses to let go, from the whispers we are too quick to dismiss. Because silence is the killer's ally, and only by speaking, by remembering, by refusing to look away, can stories like Ayon's keep others safe. Subscribe for more cases that must be remembered, because forgetting is never an option.